Slop of the week. That is our segment where, it's usually around the trade deadline, sometimes, beginning of the year with extensions and whatnot, but it is the dregs of the news cycle in the NBA. It is the stuff that creeps around Reddit and, the NBA Centrals and such on Twitter, but occasionally one of those sloppy items is worth talking about, and this one qualifies. Klay Thompson went on Draymond Green's podcast. He also has been playing pretty well and had an article written about him over at The Athletic by longtime Warriors beat writer Tim Kawakami about his free agency coming up, which, because he did not sign an extension, is still looming over the end of this season out in Golden State. I'll throw some of the items here at you. You take it down the lane that feels most interesting to you, Wes, which one of is the Magic, a team that we know needs shooting. They're relying on Gary Harris and Joe Ingles to be their theoretical floor spacing. Apparently, one of the worst kept secrets in the league, according to The Athletic, that Orlando might offer Klay a, quote, ton of money next summer, all in an effort from the Warriors side, if they were to let him go, to get out of the tax, according to Tim Kawakami. Which side of that do you feel like you buy the most? Which side of that do you feel like interests you the most big picture? Where do you want to take this slop?
I got two different answers to those two different questions. The part that I buy the most is that the Warriors are going to be looking to cut some payroll here. That has also been a badly kept secret for quite a while. Joe Lacob, the owner there, has been basically looking for an excuse. That seems like a little bit of an extreme there. But as long as that team was winning at a high level, he was willing to pay boatloads of money for that team. But they're not winning at a high level, right? Who knows what's going to happen in the playoffs, but the regular season product hasn't been worth the investment. And so I think he's looking around. He's like, yeah, I think we can. There's some dead money here that we might be able to spare and save us some room against the tax here, or maybe even get out of it completely. So that part I buy 100%. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The part that interests me the most is, where does Klay Thompson end up if he doesn't end up in Golden State? Because there's a lot of ways that Joe Lacob can go about cutting costs. It doesn't have to be letting Klay Thompson walk, but certainly the easiest way is to let Klay Thompson walk. And so that part to me is very interesting.
Yeah, they have Chris Paul, $30 million, but it's fully non-guaranteed. So they can just cut him. They are basically at the tax without Klay on the books for next year and with Chris on the books. So there's some world where maybe you just cut Chris and re-sign Klay to a number less than 30, which is what Chris is locked in at now, and that already gets you there. They have a lot of their young talent still under contract. They extended Draymond. Maybe that is just the long and short of it. But I feel like, Wes, if this is circulating, that the Warriors are open to changing things up, we'll say, just as a broad way to describe everything on the table for them. That feels like not that much different because, okay, the money is one thing. I don't think they want to be bad. I don't think you can be bad with the roster they have. And I also don't think you can just keep running it back with a group that has been in a play-in for 2 straight years. Is there a way they can improve and cut salary? Is there like a magic formula here that you see? They have some tradable stuff. They have picks. I mean, they've never really gone all in with these mega trades the way some of these other contending teams have. Is that on the table for you, or do you think that this is just going to be something they ride into the sunset and, play out the rest of Curry's contract, kind of see where things go and let it play its course?
I definitely think there's a nostalgic element here when it comes to trying to keep Klay and Draymond and Steph all together. I don't think that can be discounted. I don't know that it's number one on the list of priorities. So if the Warriors do indeed let Klay Thompson walk, I think then everything becomes on the table, right? Everything gets on the table at that point. And so I think if you let Klay Thompson walk and just waive Chris Paul outright, and I do think that was part of the calculus of not trading Chris Paul's contract before the deadline was, hey, this thing's fully non-guaranteed. We don't really want to take long-term money back because we kind of like having this out here of just being able to waive him and get and save almost $30 million in space here. So I think if you were to just waive Chris Paul and get nothing back in return and let Klay Thompson walk, I don't think that team is that much worse than what it is now. And then you sort of say, okay, well, now we're $60 million cheaper and about the same qualitatively as a team. Now what can we do? Well, you still have Andrew Wiggins' contract of like 26-something million dollars next year. You can combine, if you really wanted to make a big move, you could take Wiggins, maybe add Kuminga and some picks to that. That can maybe get you something back. Or if the Wiggins contract is just not tradable, which at this point it might not be tradable, you can still move Draymond. Like if Klay Thompson walks, you could still move Draymond. You still have some chunky salaries from like Gary Payton and Kevon Looney and all these other, and Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody. Like you can punch those together and go make a move for sort of a bona fide number 2 potentially, or maybe a number 3 kind of guy, and improve the team overall. But I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I do think that there's a route if you just let Klay walk, if you waive Chris Paul, fine, and then maybe start putting yourself out there in terms of the picks and some of these assets and maybe one of those chunky Andrew Wiggins salaries where you say, all right, let's bunch all this stuff together, shop it around the league, and see what we can get.
Yeah, I do want to point out to correct a portion of what I said about what they do have to work with. They don't have their own pick this year. So they're in a little bit of a weird spot there. That's probably why they didn't fully bottom out. That is going to Portland. But the nostalgia is where I think maybe it's important to circle back, because what you laid out is exactly how they would improve this thing. I think if you told me they got something there, I would want a pretty hefty kind of almost star level return if I'm trading Kuminga at this point based on the development he showed this year. I'm a really big fan of Kuminga at this point. He's still very young. I agree with you that they're not that much worse with that situation that you laid out, but Klay also went, as I mentioned on Draymond's podcast this week, and there were some clips going around that were, about the ejections and all that stuff, but I don't think it's sappy to care about what that group did together. And you even just hear it in the way that Klay said, like, we wouldn't play with the freedom we do if you weren't out there. We became what we are because, all the stuff that they've all said forever about each other. I think it's an open question if Klay and Draymond in particular are just worse. Mm-hmm. If they aren't in this infrastructure playing together, playing with Steph Curry. But I also just think it's fine to let this ride out. I think what I asked you is not a crazy thing to do, even if fans are going to hate it and it's not what necessarily you want your competitive roster, your competitive organization that you spend your hours rooting for to care about most. You want it to always be winning, but they got plenty of that. So I think that will weigh heavily in the Warriors thinking pretty big about how much they would be willing to pay Klay. Do you think they would up the offer from what it reportedly was in the fall of 2 years, $48 million, if it meant keeping this guy around, even if it's maybe more than they originally would have liked to pay him?
I think, maybe when push comes to shove, because it does, like I said, it does matter to Joe Lacob and Mike Dunleavy Jr. and everybody that's sort of running, Steve Kerr, who has a voice in that front office, obviously. All that stuff really does matter. And so, I'm sure that there's some level that they'd be willing to be negotiated towards. But I would strongly doubt that they would pay him something even close to what he's making now, And so, there's got to be a price, but also you look at the teams that are out there, and it becomes very interesting. A team like Orlando Magic being involved in this does make sense, right? Because they have a ton of money that they're going to be able to spend. They can pay, if they want, Klay Thompson what he's making now. They could do it. And it would hurt, on the back end of it. But they have a ton of cap space, and it's not like they're going to be in play for Paul George. They're not going after LeBron. LeBron's not going there, right? James Harden's not going there. All these, some of the big-name free agents. So what are they going to do with this money, right? They could just, let it roll and end up using that money on extensions and all that stuff and just be like, we're not going to put ourselves in a bad salary cap situation. We'll just sort of let this cap space expire. But they're also a team that are going to be in the playoffs, and maybe you probably want to take a leap. And Klay Thompson on paper makes a lot of sense for them. So why wouldn't you just throw $28 million a year at Klay Thompson if you're the Orlando Magic, because you got nothing else to do with that money. And I think there's other teams out there too. Like, what's stopping Philadelphia if they don't get Paul George from throwing a bunch of money at Klay Thompson? What's stopping the Oklahoma City Thunder from throwing a bunch of money at Klay Thompson, right? And having like a supercharged Isaiah Joe in that lineup who might be able to take Josh Giddey's place in that starting group, which is something a lot of people think needs to happen. So, I mean,
if nothing else, I feel like Klay was smart to say no to that extension, regardless of where maybe him and his representation valued himself. I think becoming a free agent this year, where there are more teams with space and still not a lot of players to spend that money on, was just a smart business decision from a leverage and negotiation standpoint, right? You say no because why would I lock myself into that? As long as I don't completely fall off a cliff, which he definitely has not done, and he's had a strong second half of the year. He's up to 38% shooting from deep, a little down from last year, but still definitely above average, and that roll off the bench for a while was really helpful. He's back in the starting lineup, seems to have kept that momentum. Like, he's still a valuable rotation level player. Maybe on some teams he can start, maybe on some teams he's a bench guy. It doesn't really matter. He's going to be able to contribute, and that makes you $20+ million in the NBA in 2024. So, yeah, I don't love him in Orlando. You know, the rhetorical question you threw out there of like, what else are they going to do? Maybe get a point guard would be nice if it were me.
There's nobody available.
No, there's probably not. You know, so
I mean, they could do the thing where we trade for your overvalued point guard, and we're just willing to pay for him, and we can help you salary dump him like that. The salary dump options are out there. It's not just free agency. My other question with Klay Thompson is how much money would he be willing to leave on the table to return to Golden State? Right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like he's been the happiest with the Warriors this year, but I got to believe he'd prefer to stay there than have to move and play for a new team for the first time in his career, especially if it ended up being like Orlando or Oklahoma City. Like, no disrespect. Like, the Thunder are awesome as a basketball team. I don't know how motivated Klay Thompson is to leave his boat in the Bay Area to travel and start living in Oklahoma City. So
San Antonio. Yeah, probably not
exactly. Probably not going to happen. So I think that's, you can kind of look at both sides of this is how much are you willing to spend to keep Klay and Steph and Draymond together if you're the Warriors? And if you're Klay, how much money are you willing to leave on the table to make that happen too?
Yeah, he doesn't strike me as the type of player who is going to be in a mode at the end of his career of ring chase or necessarily eke every dollar and cent out of the Warriors or any other team. If he retired after the next two seasons, he's 34. That wouldn't shock anybody. So this is an end game decision for him too, and I think that matters, right? Is he really want to finish his career? This isn't his second contract where he's going out and trying to make it big and get a payday and then, figure out the rest later. This is the final chapter, and that matters. And that is coming back to some of that sentimentality from his side too, which I'm sure he feels and which would be natural to feel.